Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brendan Emser, and I'm the senior managing editor of Aperture magazine in New York. From 2011 to 2015, I was the director of exhibitions at the Walther Collection project space in New York, and I worked with my colleagues Daniela Bauman, Maria Schindeleger, Remy Anabanjo, and a number of others who are here today on exhibition projects that in some cases started out at the Walther Collection project space in New York and grew and evolved and expanded and then traveled and conquered the world via the home base in Ulm. It's really lovely to be here today, and I thank Brian Wallace, our convener, of course Arthur Walther, and Renee Musai for her lovely opening remarks. And Renee is someone who hired me for my first real internship in the photo space and have looked up to you and your work, and grateful that after the years, many years later, we're still together and thinking about all of these questions and images that have been presented to us. So thank you for that. Brian, when we walked in yesterday, said, "Oh, isn't it like being in this space, isn't it like seeing old friends?" And he was referring to the artworks, which, yes, seeing all of these artworks that many of which I personally handled in storage spaces in New York or wherever, it was like seeing old friends, like seeing Malik Sidibé's pictures, seeing Senta Mofokeng's pictures, but also seeing old friends in this kind of extended family or village that has grown, evolved, and expanded around Arthur Walther and the Walther Collection. So it's really a pleasure to be among family again. Guy Tillam has said that one calls an experience formative because it forms us. And this is an interview that he gave with Arthur Walther for his really fantastic monograph several years ago. And I think an experience can form us and can inform us in the sense of expanding our knowledge and our sense of the world. I wanted to start with Guy's words there. In 2004, I was working in South Africa in the field of public health activism, and I would frequently go to museums on the weekends. And one day I happened to visit an exhibition at the National Gallery in Cape Town, which was presenting a program around a decade of democracy. So 2004 would be 10 years after the democratically elected government came to power in South Africa. And what I remember so vividly from that exhibition experience were photographs by Guy Tillam that were made in Kuhinga, and Tracy Rose, whose works are also part of the Walther Collection. And not too long after that, I was in Paris, and again, by chance, although maybe there's no such thing as chance, I happened to visit Centre Pompidou. I took the escalators up and I went to see an exhibition called Africa Remix, curated by Simone Jami, which introduced me to the work of Samuel Fosso, who I'm obsessed with and who has been my muse and who is not in this room at the moment, but he's like royalty, I think. We're in the presence of royalty when Samuel Fosso is in the room. And that exhibition, Africa Remix, I think, set forth a path, opened our eyes to so many artistic visions and careers that I think we've seen travel over the last two decades. And those two exhibition experiences were followed by Okwi and Wezor's Snap Judgments, of course, at the International Center of Photography, another formative encounter. So with these exhibition projects, I was beginning to link the ideas between African art, photography, video, and this really thrilling idea of the contemporary and what that would mean, and what I was beginning to see it meaning across these curatorial interventions. Contemporary is a term that we have used frequently in different types of projects at the Walther Collection over the years, but contemporary would seem to have different meanings depending on where we stand in time. For example, Malik Sidibé, Seydou Keita, and Senta Mofokeng were all participants in the first Bamako biennial in 1994, and their work is no doubt contemporary and must have been thrillingly so at that first Bamako encounters. And yet they're no longer with us. nor is David Goldblatt or Tabiso Sakala, nor BC Silva, nor Okwi Enwezor. People who have really shown us what this field could be, I would say. So perhaps one way we might think about this idea of the contemporary is that distance between what the scholar Erika Nimis, who wrote about the first Bamako biennial, has called, and quote, the effervescence, the joy of discovery, the joy of celebrating photography, and what Remy, Daniela, Arthur, and Joshua Chuang called in their 2017 exhibition, Recent Histories. That might be one way of animating the larger question to this panel. So how are all of these exhibition projects that we're talking about, not only through the Walther Collection, but through the work of the curators that we have assembled here and the artists who have participated in many of them, how can these projects serve as primary texts? So this is, Brian, where I'm going slightly off script from what you have set forth from us. I was really interested in the idea of primary text, and I think we're going to break that down just a little bit. But I'm very pleased to introduce this distinguished group of people who I've admired for a long time and really had the great honor of working with, of seeing Sandrine, for example, come up through graduate school in New York, and of course Simon almost 20 years ago, seeing your exhibitions and Guy's work when I was only 19 years old. So anyway, and Tamar, of course, who was a comrade in arms with the project for the Walther Collection. So Sandrine Cohard is assistant professor, yes. And Joe, oh yes, Joe, sorry. I have your bio here, and Joe and I have had many great nights out together in New York City and elsewhere. And Joe, I wish you were here, but I'm very glad you're here televisually. So we welcome you over the airwaves. So Sandrine Cohard is an assistant professor of African art history at Rutgers, and she holds a PhD in art history from Columbia University. And her scholarly interests include post-colonialism in the arts, portraiture, vernacular photography, and representation of gender and domesticity. And in 2019, Dr. Cohard organized The Way She Looks, a history of female gazes in African portraiture, which we'll talk about. And that was presented by the Ryerson Image Center in Toronto. Tamar Garb is the Durning Lawrence Professor in the History of Art at University College of London, and her recent curatorial projects include Figures and Fictions, Contemporary South African Photography, Distance and Desire, Encounters with the African Archive, of which a chapter is on view as part of this exhibition, and projects with William Kentridge, Vivian Corland, and one of which was in honor of Okwi Enwezor, so maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. And another exhibition called Homelands, Landmarks. I love that title. So Simon Jami is a Paris-based independent curator, lecturer, writer, and art critic, and the curator of many, many, many important exhibitions, including 4 editions of the Bamako Biennial, of course, Africa Remix, which we just discussed, and the catalog of which is actually in this library here in this room, which I'm happy to see, and also many other projects, including the Dakar Biennial, and has created and directed the Pan-African Master Classes in Photography for 12 years and set up permanent art collections in Guadeloupe. And Simon, when I sent out my email about this panel, gently implied that I needed to do a little bit more homework. So I thank him for that prompt, and I did do that homework. So Jo Ratcliffe, joining us via Zoom from her lovely kitchen in Cape Town, is a South African photographer whose work has been shown in exhibitions around the world for more than 20 years, including many group exhibitions with the Walther Collection and a solo exhibition called Asteris de Femme de Mundo, which was the inaugural exhibition of the Walther Collection project space in 2011, and that was organized with Corinne Desarène and became a key component in the larger exhibition called Appropriated Landscapes at the Walther Collection in 2011. And Joe's first United States monographic survey called Drives was presented at the Art Institute of Chicago recently, and accompanied by a massive and impressive and really formidable catalog called Photographs 1980s to Now, published by Steidl and the Walther Collection. And finally, Guy Tillam is a South African photographer who was born in Johannesburg and started photographing professionally in the 1980s, working with Afropix. And among his many awards over the years and projects, Tillam was the first Robert Gardner Fellow in Photography from the Peabody Museum at Harvard University, which resulted in one of his signal bodies of work and an accompanying publication called Avenue Patrice Lumumba, which considers the dreams and structures of modernism in Africa. And his work was included in Documenta, the Sao Paulo Biennial, and in Africa Remix, which we mentioned. And his first monograph, well, not first, but major kind of survey monograph, was published by the Walther Collection in 2015 and Steidl, and includes kind of a lot of primary texts, actually, and also a lot of collected writings by Simon, by Okwe Enwezor, by a number of critics who wrote about Guy's work over the years. So finally, just to get started, I wanted to quickly show you a few images of installation views of projects from the Walther Collection over the years so that you have a kind of visual reference for the different configurations that these artworks have been through and the different curators who've come through them. So this first one is the Events of the Self, which we saw earlier today, 2010, what Remy showed in her loop. So these are just to give you some visuals. Also Events of the Self. This is Appropriated Landscape. So, and these works, I realize they're a little bit small, but this is Guy Tillam's work from Avenue Patrice Lumumba. This is Distance and Desire, which Tamar Garb organized it, also at the Walther Collection in Neu-Ulm. This is the presentation of Distance and Desire at CO Berlin, which had a different look and was so beautifully installed. I really think that was one of the great moments for this exhibition's kind of trajectory. This is also in Berlin. This is Joe Ratcliffe's solo exhibition at the Walther Collection Project Space in 2011. As I mentioned, the first project in that exhibition space, and these works are also on view in this exhibition just outside this room. Corinne's wall that she wanted to hang in the space, which was beautiful and which had many lives beyond Joe's exhibition. And this is Simon's exhibition After Eden at Maison Rouge in Paris. This is Structures of Identity at the Amparo Museum in Puebla in Mexico. Same again here. Recent Histories at the Bamako Biennial, and also Recent Histories. And finally, The Way She Looks, which Sandrine organized at the Ryerson Center in Toronto. Really dramatic installation. I wish I could have seen that exhibition. And finally, just some catalogs pertaining to the panelists with us today. So the catalog for Distance and Desire, Guy Tillam's beautiful monograph, the exhibition catalog for After Eden, and finally Joe Ratcliffe's survey catalog. So I will leave you, unlike the earlier presentation, we won't be on loop, but I'll just leave you with this image, a bit of a Wunderkammer from the presentation at Maison Rouge. So with all of that prelude, the reason why I was thinking about primary texts in relation to the this panel was twofold. One is that in the field of African art, and in particular contemporary African art, the literature is new. And when I was a graduate student at New York University, I frequently struggled to find primary texts, and I frequently struggled to find a critical apparatus that would help me as a student and as a researcher and as a writer to figure out how to describe, situate, and think through works by artists such as Samuel Fosso. And I frequently, 9 times out of 10, the kernel of knowledge that I needed or wanted or eventually cited was an exhibition catalog. And I think this is not the experience that one would have if you were studying 17th century, Italian something or other. I mean, there is a small but significant library, and I think curators, Okwi, of course, B.C. Silva, Simon, and many others are responsible for giving us these primary texts, and it's only been in the last few decades that they have begun to build up. So I realized that a primary text has its own set of definitions, and I'm breaking some of them. But I wanted to open up that concept among the artists and the scholars, curators that we have together on this panel. And I thought I would start with Tamar, actually, because Tamar was responsible for one aspect of looking at the artworks in the collection where we go back in time, we go into the 19th century, and we look at really difficult images that are not easy to think about. They're not easy to remember. They stay in your mind. But you brought a level of, such a high level of scholarship, as Renee said earlier, and care and deep inquiry. So I wanted to start with you, Tamar, and just read one quote from your interview with Arthur Walther in the Distance and Desire catalog. And so this is Tamar speaking. For a long time, I have been fascinated by the fact that photographs of people can provide a space of encounter between the preconceptions and habits of mind of their authors, who themselves are products of their time, and the stubborn present, sometimes even resistance, of the subjects they're picturing. So with those words in mind, Tamar, I was hoping you could sketch out a little bit for us your journey into making Distance and Desire and some of the previous exhibitions or research that informed you and prepared you for that book and that exhibition.
Thank you so much, Brendan, and thank you, Arthur, for the opportunity to work with this extraordinary material. Distance and Desire was my first foray, really, into 19th century photography. I mean, I was a 19th century specialist, working primarily in painting as a feminist scholar, a scholar of gender and sexuality and the body, and all my earliest publications were around the politics of representation and gender in 19th and early 20th century European painting. So when Arthur approached me, he had seen Figures and Fictions, which was an exhibition about contemporary South African photography. He'd seen that, and he approached me to ask me to think with him about this collection, which he was in the process of acquiring and amassing at that time. It was a process that was ongoing. I was interested in speaking to some of the curators, to Vivian and others yesterday, where people were talking about, Crate 17, which I understand was your invention in a way. But of course, in the moment when I started to work with Arthur and you, Brendan and Maria, and there was no such thing as Crate 17. All there were a collection of ephemeral objects that Arthur had started to collect, some albums, some photographs. I mean, the carte de visite that I then wrote a whole essay on in the catalogue existed in a funny little box sitting in a drawer in Ulm. Nobody knew what they were, where they had been made, or for whom they had been made. There was no discourse around that particular collection of objects. So in that sense, the photographs themselves are primary texts. They are objects which you then set into motion in order to try to make sense of. And that set me off on a whole, a research journey to Kimberley in South Africa, to trace the authors, to try to understand the dynamics that were in place through which those photographs were made, the colonial context, the context of commodification and circulation through which those images were given meaning, the inscriptions. Think about your concept of the primary text. Each one of those cartes de visite came wrapped in text, not only the little French labels that you see below each one. I'd actually think are they there with the French labels on? And then on the back of them, of course, are English translations, and then you start to begin to imagine, well, who wrote that, and for whom, and how were they circulated, and who held these things, and why is there French on the front and English on the back? And then you start to look at the back, and you see that there are stamps of certain photographic studios, so you start to think, well, who were they? And, you know, you begin to look, and this text, the photograph, rather than there being a whole world of textual narrative that explains the photograph, there is a kind of organic give and take between photographic objects and their reproducibility and mediation, and the other kinds of materials that help you to understand. And it's a dialogue. The photographs sometimes push back. So I think the question of the primary text, particularly in a technology like photography, is a complex one, because we think of photography as, as a technology of reproduction. And insofar as it's a technology of reproduction, coterminous with modernity, as we were saying earlier, photographs exist in multiple iterations, and each iteration is another primary text, which begets other texts and other forms of explanation and interpretation. So the complexity of each one of those objects that sit there in the vitrine that we have out there is that from each one you can tell multiple stories. So it's a complex archive. It's a fraught archive. I have my own. It had my own deep ambivalence at the moment that Arthur approached me, and we talked very honestly and openly about this. I mean, every single decision. You see these now, they came in a crate. How do you mount them? Do you leave the text that sits on the border of the photograph? Do you try to show them so they can see back and front? In the first iteration of Distance and Desire, where there was interesting information on the back of the photograph, we decided that these were objects, not images, and they needed to be shown three-dimensionally so people could walk around them. We needed to, in a sense, think about the materiality, because they're not only images, they are material objects that have been exchanged and held and circulated. So the curatorial decisions that you make in relation to the integrity of each object is a complex one, and it's an intellectual and an ethical and an aesthetic and a political set of questions that you bring to each one of those decisions. I'm at this point, free associating, because there's so much one could talk about in relation to each of those objects. But it's a difficult archive. Absolutely, it's a difficult archive. But I think it's one that we have to engage with in order to have a sense of the historicity of the medium and the historicity of the accretion of images and icons and materials that constitute the present in which we still live, and through which these artists so extraordinarily create meaning.
And just to ask one question following on that thought, why do you think it is so important for this collection to have focused on deep research in the 19th century when the first two major exhibitions were contemporary, and in a moment where there is a demand for the contemporary, there is a demand for the newest, youngest, hottest artists? I mean, it was a surprising turn, some might say, for a collector to go back in time into a very, as you say, ambivalent, tricky, and unresolved moment. Now, with some years of distance, and especially in this exhibition where, your contributions are in this kind of vitrine, how do you feel that those 19th century materials activate or inform us about the other content, the other image-making practices?
So, the one very simple answer is because so many of these artists engage with that archive. This is not a dead archive. It's an ongoing archive. And you just have to look at the Candice Brights at the top over there in your image, and the incredible debates that actually circulated in the 90s around those images, in which Okwe and Weezer, in a very, very classic and kind of damning article, actually took Candice to task. And then, of course, how those debates have evolved, because debates and politics also don't stand still. That was a particular moment in the 90s around who had the right to represent whose bodies and to what effect and to what purpose and how those were going to be used. I mean, these are the multiple histories that are actually embedded in the photographs in the collection. So you can't show contemporary work, in my opinion, as if it just got, dropped from Mars. This is work that is actually engaging with history. It is work that is absolutely imbricated in history, difficult histories. It navigates them in a dialogical, sometimes in an ironic, sometimes in a funny way, as you see with Fosso over here, or you see the kind of Jodie Bieber, what she's doing, or Sami Balogi, etc., Zanelli over there. I mean, the so-called ethnographic archive, itself a complex concept, which is not one that I'm very comfortable with anymore. But, the work demands that of us. That would be my one thing. And my second thing is I'm a historian. I don't see how we can understand where we are at without understanding something of the lineages, the genealogies, the ruptures, the continuities, the debates that constitute the present. We do not come into the present, like naked creatures onto the planet.
And with that said, this Edenic image, we moved to Simon, who, as I mentioned, organized an exhibition at Maison Rouge in Paris called After Eden. And for those of you who may not know Maison Rouge, I think it does no longer exist, but it was a very special place that put together exhibitions from private collections, which is an incredible opportunity for an audience to see a private collection that is not otherwise accessible. And they put together what I think is just one of the most exciting presentations of the Walther Collection by kind of mixing up many, many different elements of Arthur's pattern of collecting over the years. And Simon, in his interview with Arthur for that catalog, which is also a really, really nice primary text in its own way, says, I'm interested in reading the collection in a totally different manner and in telling you my point of view. I'm looking at the same images, but I might see something else. That sounds like a very characteristic statement. So I have a couple of questions for you. First of all, Crate 17, I think we need to talk about that because I have a vague memory of that, but others may need that to be explained a little bit. But After Eden, tell us what is After Eden? Where did this concept come from, and how did you develop it? Yeah.
First of all, I believe in history too, and I think that the primary texts are silent, and we're talking about people being contemporary and falling from Mars. There's no such a thing. There's always a pattern, and I remember back to the days when the European didn't know about a place. They would call it terra incognita. Or even when they wanted to take, for the Brits, they wanted to take Australia, they would call that terra nullius, the land who doesn't belong to anyone. There's no such a thing. I mean, what we call history has been a great deal of bullshit. So it's really important to question that history and to write it when there was silence. And it's obvious, and I agree with you, that a contemporary artist, a decent one, cannot just say, I'm talking about my nostril and my problem with my sexuality or whatever. It's always inscribed in something. We result in a product of something. After Eden, it was funny because when I gave Arthur the title, he says, I don't believe in God. And I say, I don't believe in God too. So at times, the primatization of photography is like a burden to me. I think that images tell stories, and at times we're forcing the images to tell the story we want them to tell. And what I wanted to do with the collection was to tell a story that would be told by the photographies. Yesterday, people insisted about Arthur being a specialist in Asia and in Africa, which I disagree totally with. I mean, he's collecting photography and has a great deal of German photography, American photography, etc., etc. And this is what interests me in the collection. I'm not that interested in talking about Africa. I think that talking about Africa sounds like a whisper. It was talking about revolution. You're too young to know the song, Tracy Chapman.
I've heard of her.
And I think that what is important, Lacan, who was an old friend of mine, even if he was dead when I was born, he said that we only exist through the other. And there's this French writer who wrote Friday, the Salvage Life, and basically he was rewriting the Robinson Crusoe story, and was saying basically that Robinson was saved by Friday, because Robinson didn't know who he was anymore. He thought he was a British, thought he was, but without nobody to contest or to confirm, he was no one. So the most important character in Robinson Crusoe is Friday, who explained to Robinson who the fuck he is. He's a colonialist and whatever discoverer. So what interested me in the collection was precisely that it was not specialized. It was dealing with photography from a certain point of view, because it's collected by somebody. And it was precisely the dialogues that could be found there, where I believe that everybody share what some philosophers call the chaotic world of sensations. And language, and we could say photography is a language, is what transforms this chaotic world of sensation into forms and images. And my first point of view is that there's no such a thing as Asia or Africa. They're human beings living in different places, having this world, the chaotic world of sensations, and trying to translate it into something. And what I'm interested in when I see a collection of images is to try to find how people have been trying to translate whatever they were doing. And after Eden came by looking at the images. And you see that from Blossfeld, who could be seen as a kind of a paradise, even if it's a very well-organized paradise, but it was kind of ecologic before time. It was fighting the, how do you call that now? The Anthropocene. That's great bullshit again. Anyway, you see things, and then you walk through deserts, you walk through terrible landscapes, and then all of a sudden the buildings appears, and then after the buildings, the humans, etc., etc. And my point of view is that any photography is a self-portrait. May it be a landscape, may it be whatever, it's always telling me about the person who took the picture. Because there's something important in photography. I'm not a specialist, but this is what we call the point of view, the place from where you take the image. And then the story for me when I was in New Ulm looking at the things was very obvious. How you start from the desert, and then you build, and then human comes. And when human comes, problems arise. Like apartheid, whatever, and then the self, the definition of the self, not only the self as a black or yellow or green person, but the self as who am I? I mean, that was what was written, as you remember, in the Delphi's temple, know thyself. And I think that this is what I'm interested in.
Well,
and
you say all of this with so much certainty, but the way you laid out the exhibition was through ideas of fictions. So fiction of the city, fiction of the landscape, fiction of the other. Why fictions?
Well, because photography is fiction. Every art form is fiction. There's no such a thing, Theo, and this morning people were saying about it. I mean, any image is not reality. It's a process. It's a point of view. So it's a story. I remember when I was giving some master classes in photography, there were two images taken in Kenya, I think, in a church. In one of them, you see a guy bleeding in the central LA, and you have military guys behind him, and you're like, this guy is finished. But another guy took a picture in the same church, looking at the door. I say, okay, this guy is not finished. Because there are plenty of people, journalists, etc., etc. So photography is a fiction, and it's a fiction of the self. We are trying, as human beings, to tell a story. I mean, Walther's collection is a fiction. It's a fiction that he built. And I think that there's nothing more real than fiction. I don't believe in reality. I believe in fiction. Because I don't cry that much. I mean, long ago, I don't know, something happened in my biological body. But I could cry looking at a movie because the guy died or the girl died, and I know they didn't die, but the story was well told. And I think that this is what we need. We need to tell good stories because whatever the reality that is represented, that reality is always a construction. And what matters in that dialogue is not necessarily to tell the truth, it's to speak with the other by any means necessary, like Samuel Fosse would say it in one of his self-portrait when he was Malcolm X.
Well, I think that this question about after Eden, what does that mean? I think there's one image in this exhibition that was part of Corinne's exhibition, Appropriated Landscapes, and very much part of yours, which is David Goldblatt's photograph of the almond hedge, built in the 1600s, and was the first demarcating structure to separate people. I mean, to think that using something from Edenic, to use your term, a plant, to separate people in that structure that David was focused on throughout his photographic career, that is one image that I think enlivens this idea of afterness, after Eden. I do want to come back to Crate 17, so hold that in suspense while we turn to...
Just wanted to add something, because I know you're not going to ask me the question. But when I started to deal with art here, I was like, this guy is nuts. And I love his nutsness. He was the first collector I knew who went to the cave, went to the factory to learn. He didn't intend. I never saw one of his images. I guess he's a very bad photographer, but that's not the point. But he went to learn, to know what he was dealing with, and that was already very crazy. And the other thing is the notion of a single image. Because in a fiction, you cannot work with a single image. You need sentences. And his obsession with body of works makes sense to photography to me.
Yes.
I know I'm guilty for that. I invented photographers who only made one image. That's the only image I've seen, and people thought they were great photographers. But you can only know or meet a photographer only through a certain amount of work. So that was his two madness, his obsession with collecting body of works, and his obsession of knowing what he was dealing with.
Yeah, I'm happy that you underscored that point, and not just one word, but sentences, paragraphs, and fictions, as you say, novels. Even when we look at the work of Jo Ratcliffe, which I'm sure she'll tell us, like, her stories from Angola are like novels. I mean, you can't just have one photograph, but you accumulate knowledge through 70 pictures and writing and all of this. So I want to turn now to Sandrine and her exhibition called The Way She Looks. Again, this was presented at Ryerson Image Center in Toronto. And listening to you, Tamar, and remembering your deep engagement throughout your career with feminist art history, and this seems like an exhibition that crosses your Venn diagrams very much. But can you tell us, first of all, how you came into the space of the Walther Collection, and why this exhibition, and how you selected works, the idea of the gaze, and how you deselected works, how you chose what not to present. So maybe you can take us behind the scenes of your curatorial process with this project.
Hello.
Oh, I think you need it.
Hello, everyone. How I came into the space of the Walther Collection. I think with time passes, I realize what chance we got to be, students of African photography while, Arthur was building the collection, and especially being in New York at that time and being in close proximity to the collection was an incredible chance, and it became a primary text. I completely relate to what you were saying earlier, that when, as grad students in those years, there were very few texts, critical texts we could rely on. And it, of course, has to do with the belatedness that you mentioned in the email, to all of us when we were preparing for this discussion, that many of the images arrived to the West, or they were shown many times before there was really a critical discourse. So I really feel like ever since we've been playing a game of critical catch-up with these images that have been shown so much and not studied enough yet. So this is definitely one of the things that makes the Walther Collection so important, is that it has played that role of showing, building critical discourse. And I think the word collection doesn't really make justice to the dynamism of that place. The word collection has something very definitive about it. But when I think about the Walther Collection, I see something that's extremely dynamic, that's constantly moving, and not just images, but also all the scholarship that's being built, all the curators who have worked. To me, this is really the entire, the thing is really the collection. And to talk about the way she looks, it's something that I wanted to do for a long time. Very often, all my projects are born from an impatience on my part, or a sort of dissatisfaction with the state of things, the way things are being discussed, and I was uncomfortable with the degree of emphasis on the body as the single lens to talk about, African women in photography. And I wanted to change that, I wanted to talk about their own vision even before they were, holding a camera. And of course, there's so much research still to be done that I'm sure we will find many more female photographers in history. But in the 90s and 2000s, there were suddenly this, new generations of female African photographers, and I really wanted to historicize, and I completely agree with Tamar that the historicization is crucially important for artists working with the archives, but really more generally, that it's not a spontaneous creation, something that just happened and has no history. So I wanted to talk about gazes of African women, and it's really, I think it's probably one of the most unstudied, gaze in all the theories of the gazes, the black female gaze. And when I was preparing for this exhibition, I remember the title came very quickly, and I tested it with many people. And every single time, everybody assumed I was talking about the way they physically looked. Not one single person said the way she actively looks at everything. And so I was like, this is definitely a topic. This exhibition is a topic. And so I wanted to go back in time and to speak about how African women, managed to self-fashion themselves, even when they were not holding the camera. This is something I'm still working on, trying to imagine a photographic gaze that's not from the point of view of the photographer, but really from the position of the subject. And I thought that, of course, colonial photography, that whole period has such a number of very painful and violent images, but I think that there was also another story to be told, and that we were not really caring, and I really loved Renée's introduction, we were not really caring for the subject if we did not allow another story to be told as well. If these women, in their circumstances, resisted in the really large sense of the word, meaning had their own presence, and we kept only concentrated on something else, I think we were perpetuating a sort of violence. And so I really started to work on these images, to look deeply at these images, and trying to see within these images, the historical images I'm speaking about here, how they managed to retain, an agency in these images. So that was really for the historical part, and I managed to keep that thread throughout the exhibition. So that was the historical, the colonial period part. The more modern period, I don't think we have an image here, which was more studio, portraiture, etc. There was a huge emphasis on the notion of the author when the images of Seydou Keita and Malik Sidibé arrived. There was, of course, a big effort to show these images as being, beautiful modern artworks, and there was such an emphasis on that the subjects were very often forgotten. So I focused on that as well. I wanted to, and this is also something that's actually becoming another project, showing how the way women dressed, the textile that they were using was a real authorship in these images. And then, the contemporary period is wonderful because you have this explosion of, generations of young female photographers. And this idea of historicizing all of that was extremely important to show that, and it's something, when African photography arrived on the art market, it became so popular and so successful that it became very quickly, globally consumed with very often little care for the history of these images and the fact that, exactly. So that's why I really like the idea of approaching all of that as primary text.
So thank you, Sandrine. I would like to come back to some of those thoughts, but I want to move just briefly to Mr. Guy Tillum, who is actually leaving shortly, and I want to make sure he has a chance to share some thoughts with us before he goes to the train station. And just as by way of transition, I would just note that the installation view that we're looking at now from Sandrine's show in Toronto includes works by Guy Tillum from the Kunga series, which is what I mentioned earlier, shown in 2004 in Cape Town and again in Africa Remix, and is very much part of the Walther Collection. And I was intrigued and delighted that the idea of the female gaze was not just the gaze behind the camera, but the activation of the subject as looking and not being consumed, not being objectified, but the pictures of women were asking us to think deeply about the lives of the subjects, whether it's in Kiminga is Congo.
Angola.
Angola, sorry. Yeah. Or, whether it's Samuel Foso in the spectacular guise of Angela Davis, which maybe we could come back to. But Guy, as I mentioned, the Walther Collection published your first major retrospective catalog in 2015, and in that project, Guy recorded a very, very, very long interview with Arthur Walther in Millbrook, which I think was the result of several hours, and sort of by the end, maybe you were having dinner and opened some bottles of wine. And I, as an editor, the interview format is one that I love, and probably because I'm obsessed with primary text and getting artists to speak on record and tell us their visions and thoughts is like absolutely essential. And my point of view, and you were really vulnerable in that interview, and I probably went to some places that you hadn't given us previously, your readership, and therefore it's an essential primary text. And in that interview, by the way, in the interview, there's a really lovely illustration of Guy Tillum as a child at your 6th birthday or something, and I just find that so precious. But anyway, in the interview with Arthur, you say, can I become, and this is really about maybe your photography from the 1980s and photojournalism as distinct from art practice, but you say, can I become this neutral vessel? Can I become a reliable witness to an event instead of putting a kind of spin on it or affecting it with my projection? So I know we have a limited time with you today, but I was hoping you could sketch out a little bit for us your journey from Afropix and your reportage, and how you, in my estimation, although it's maybe different in your own perspective, but how you slowed down a little bit and began to make pictures that have such strong structures. You're interested in the land, you're interested in what Okwi called the land as archive. And yeah, can you just tell us a little bit about that journey as an artist?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Kaninga and Avenue Patrice Lumumba, because they're two sort of works where, that is two works where my kind of interests and preoccupations hinge, really. The one is, you know, a kind of photojournalism, you know, displaced people in Angola, which is the Kaninga portraits. And the other is, you know, there are no events. I'm looking at the surroundings. You know, the photographic work and, you know, news coming out of Africa in the 1980s and 90s was kind of preoccupied, I think, mainly with catastrophes at the time, and I was no exception. But at a certain point, I became very interested in the surroundings, and sort of, you know, to me, suddenly I became aware that history was written sort of on the outside of things, in a way. You know, so you could see it, and it coincided with, you know, my lifetime, the post-colonial environment from, you know, colonial states, post-colonial states, and then, you know, the second revolution, which happened in my lifetime too, which was this sort of movement from, you know, post-colonial states to sort of globalized capitalist regimes, mostly. And I found this fascinating, and photographed the buildings and the streets. I mean, the problem there is, you know, there was quite, I mean, you could say decay for many complex reasons. Parts of cities were breaking down, and it was all too easy to make a simplistic visual sort of metaphor for African political condition of a certain era, and I really wanted to avoid that. You know, my fascination was of entirely different order. It was of, I suppose, a place that was reinventing itself, having a pattern of an indisputably African identity, of being, you know, young in a place that was becoming something new. You know, that kind of thing excited me. And of course, this, you mentioned the sort of neutral, this empty vessel. You know, one became aware of one's projections onto, not only through photojournalism, who needed a kind of punchline, you know, a quick, a readily accessible punchline, good and evil in South Africa, whatever it might have been. But, you know, one wanted to somehow let a place speak for itself for once, if one possibly could. And, you know, if it's going to speak through you, then, well, you know, the question arrives, well, you know, who are you? I mean, so, and that's possibly a life quest. But, you know, I think that was a preoccupation, that sort of, that desire for neutrality, because it was so fascinating to see like that, not just photograph like that.
Mm-hmm. Do you go back and look at your reportage sometimes, or is that is to say, how do you feel about the images now, you know, 30 years later? Have you come to terms with them, or are they still kind of live wires for you? And I should mention, Guy, you know, was photographing for Agence France Presse, and like you were in the field, so to speak, in a way that some other artists in the collection were not working in that way. So,
I think, you know, I mean, I do try not to revisit them. I mean, I'm not sure I have quite dealt with it, but, you know, I suppose I was trying to, in the beginning of a career, trying to emulate American and European photojournalists, people I admired. I still admire them, that's not a question of that. It's just that they existed in that kind of over a way I can only describe as a sort of triangulation of drama, you know, moving in and out of frames. So a kind of motif that was used, a device that was used to create, you know, a kind of immersion in a scene, used to create a kind of suggestion or a hint that this was a committed position. And, you know, what I found, and certainly, you know, it's evident if I look back at that work, is that I was looking for the same drama in different situations, which was, yeah, it was unsatisfying.
with Avenue Patrice Lumumba, I was really struck by your anticipation of how it might be read as that body of work might be read as a text that might say something about ruins, about failed dreams in Africa. Could you tell us a little bit about what Avenue Patrice Lumumba means as an organizing principle, but also as, just practically speaking, the number of streets throughout the countries that were named? So that's the first part of this question. The second one is your idea of reading dreams and optimism. We were talking a little bit about optimism last night, but you don't look at those buildings necessarily as tragedies or ruins. I think you have a very layered way of reading your own images. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, of course, it's not. I didn't look for every Avenue Patrice Lumumba in Africa, and I didn't, confine myself to Avenue Patrice Lumumba or boulevards or what it might be. It was, Lumumba was killed before his dream could be proven true, which was a kind of autonomy free from post-colonial intervention or identity, and an ideal for which he died. Whether he was going to be proven right, one will never know. However, I think for me these buildings had this enormous pathos. However inappropriate they may have been in a sort of in a colonial context, nonetheless they were embodiments of dreams and desires and hopes for a kind of future that for people it did, and they were in the process of transition, and that process was extremely interesting to me. I'd started that kind of work in Johannesburg, and it was really a kind of a realization that I could be in a place and with a certain kind of neutrality I could convey a kind of truth without trying to manipulate or create drama or narrative.
Well, you gave us a set of images which have such profound staying power, and one of my favorites is the high school, the Atine High School, that looks like a painting. And in looking at your images again, I thought, William Kentridge has directed an opera. I think you should do some stage sets for an opera one day, because your architectural sensibility and your deep understanding of the meanings of architecture, I think, would provide a beautiful stage set. So that is my next task for you, to direct an opera. I want to move to bring Joe Ratcliffe into this conversation, and thank you, Guy. Joe, can you hear us okay? And see us. So Joe has sent over a few images, a few of which are in this exhibition. Joe, we worked together on your solo exhibition in New York in 2011, which was really a delight. And one thing that you gave us, among many, in that exhibition is the task to read your photographs the way you would read a brilliant work of nonfiction. You are such a superb writer, and I think you are also, maybe imagine yourself as a literary character, have a deep love of writing and literature, and I think that the way your exhibition unrolled in New York was a task for the audience member to learn how to read, actually, to read your words, which are very much part of your artworks, but also to read into what had happened in As Terras de Femme de Mundo. I mean, what had happened in the past tense. So I wanted to start with a couple of questions. One is, can you tell us the story of when you first met Arthur Walther, which I think was with Okwi in Johannesburg, and this was recounted in the New York Times article on the occasion of the opening of the project space, and I think you didn't love the way the New York Times reporter told that story, but maybe you can tell us in your own words what that first encounter was and what happened from there.
I first met Arthur when Okwi was coming out and looking for work for Snap Judgments, and they both came to my house, and actually I don't think Arthur and I said a word. I might be wrong, but Arthur was absolutely silent, observing. But he bought some work. And then sometime later, we started having a discussion around the work of As Terras do Fim do Mundo, which was the work that I had, the second project I had done in Angola. And I think, well, I don't know, it's a funny question, Brendan. I don't know. It was more that first sale to Arte allowed me to build a studio, which was fantastic. So I had a studio. But I think the article you're referring to was a bit like I sort of was almost on the street. I had a sense that I was this, homeless person, and they built a studio. I mean, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I mean, I just liked your wry observation of that reporter's take on it. But I remember that detail about the studio, and that is not to be taken lightly, because the support of artists in this collection is not just about showing artworks, but it's about being supportive of the lives of artists. And again, to draw upon this lexicon that Renee gave us earlier, this idea of care, I mean, that is one way of thinking about this community. But anyway, with As Terras de Fem do Mundo, first of all, for those of you who have already seen Joe's work in this exhibition, the entire wall, Joe, your work is beautifully installed here on one wall. Whereas in New York it was one exhibition and laid out in a very, very different way. But also in New York we showed platinum prints, which are absolutely exquisite. Here we have gelatin silver prints, I think, and I hope that, no, what are these? Inkjets. Okay, so I hope that we will see those platinum prints in an exhibition again soon, because they are such special objects. But I wanted to ask you, with regard to As Terras de Fem do Mundo and some of your other projects, why is writing so integral to your artistic process? And a little bit like David Goldblatt, but also distinct from him, the text is part of the work, or at least in my interpretation. You're reporting, you're giving us context, you're telling stories, and you're helping us to read the images and the terrain. So why is that so important to you, and how did that become important to you?
I had fantasies of being a writer before I came to photography. I never thought, I didn't think about photography as something that I would do. It was because I just couldn't write, and I was hopeless at painting when I first went to art school. And, I had got to a point where it was go and give up and do something useful. And then I did an evening course in photography, and it was like somebody had turned the light on. But I think, photography for me is very much about finding my place in the world, because I think I came to it as somebody who didn't have a place. I'm not sure that I have a place now, but it really takes me into spaces where, if I can understand the environments, the contexts that I'm working in, I have a sense of my own place in the world. And writing does the same for me. And it's interesting to hear earlier on the discussion around fiction and things being a fiction, because often it's through fiction that I can understand the real. And a lot of my projects are, I work, most of my work starts by accident in some way. It starts off either with an image that somehow doesn't work, that poses a question, which then prompts a series, or it starts with an idea in my head or something that I've read. And certainly there were two texts in As Terras do Fim do Mundo, well, three actually, that really prompted my thinking. And one was Susan Sontag's a comment earlier on photography, where she talked about seeing the photographs of Bergen-Belsen, and she had a negative epiphany, and she uses that phrase. It was almost as if some limit of horror, of her ability to kind of take in the horror, had been reached. And I was wondering if it was possible that in the absence of the event, in the failure to witness, if there could be such a thing as a negative epiphany. So if I was thinking about being in Angola sort of 20, 30 years after the war, and you are in places where there is no language. I mean, literally, there's no language. And I'm not talking about whether I could speak Portuguese or not, which I don't, but where the actual signs in the landscape are hard to read. You don't know whether you're looking at something from a few years ago or 20 years ago. And quite often you are in places without people to name them. Or it takes lots of journeys for things to fall into place, for them to be understood. So that idea of a negative epiphany was the one thing. The other was a text that I read in the early 1980s. And at that stage, I was teetering between trying to make photographs. And I remember I was photographing in Crossroads during the first state of emergency in 1986, and photographs that just absolutely didn't work. I was with a friend of mine, Roger Mankies, and I was always on the other side of the road photographing what was left in the wake of the bulldozers, and he was photographing the action. And I only realized once I'd got to Angola that my interest in the non-event or the trace or the silence and invisibility of things was really what I was trying to grapple with. And at that time, I was reading Ryszard Kapuscinski's book, Another Day of Life, about the fall of Luanda, and at that moment of independence and civil war. And there was this extraordinary passage about the dogs in the city. And it's as the people are leaving, the dogs that were left behind by the Portuguese. And he creates such an extraordinary image that seemed to be also an image of South Africa. This band of leftover animals, some of them pedigree, some of them mutts, all rollicking and having these orgies on the front lawn. And as the soldiers left, they began to slim down. And eventually one day they left the city, and he imagines a leader emerging from the ranks. And if they'd gone north, they would have run into the FNLA, or if they'd gone south, they might have run into UNITA and the South African Army. And that prompted a body of photo montages I made in the 80s. But that was very much in my mind. When I first went to Angola, I thought I would go in search of Kapuscinski's dogs. And then the other was a poem, and it's a poem by Norman McCaig, and it's actually a poem written in New York about a hotel, view from a hotel window. But there's a line in it which says, "The frontier is never somewhere else, and no stockades can keep the midnight out." And that sort of felt to me, at the kind of South African identity, that whole 80s of that laggard mentality. So those were in my mind when I go, and it's quite useful for me to have some notion in my head that I can respond to, or that can, of course, I forget about those things because the work and the process of the work determines something else, but it's a way to respond to something.
Yeah. Oh, okay. We're saying goodbye to Guy. Thank you so much for being with us, Joe. Guy. Yeah. Joe, thank you for that. I mean, we could listen to you all day long talk about literature and your images. I realize that you might not be able to see on your screen, but you sent 3 images that maybe you wanted to say a few words about. The one I have on the screen now is from Diana.
Okay, we don't need to look at that. It was actually really, it was those two, and it was in is that I can't see the pictures. Is it of Petrus Kalesh?
Yeah, it's the diptych.
From Tamar's show.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually, this goes to, can I talk?
Yeah, yeah.
Stop me. So this goes to a bigger question. It goes to a bigger a context, and it's partly what is so fantastic about working with someone like Arthur, because, I think Simone was talking about the interest in the bodies of work, or Tamar was saying that this isn't a dead archive. But I think as a photographer, the relationship with Arthur is, and it's a real relationship. It's not a question of simply you go out and you have a nice dinner and someone buys your work and you move on. There's a it is, as Sandrine was saying, a dynamic collection, and it's a collection that's really put to work. it's put to work in terms of contemporary debates and discussions. And so when your work is moved into these other contexts, for me, it's a way of reading my work anew, of understanding what I'm doing in a different way.
Joe,
but
Tamar
one
just
of
wanted
the-
to
I
add
just want-
something here.
Can I come in, Joe? Because, this is the product of working with you in... Oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I mean, we worked very closely in talking about this body of work when you were making it, and I think it brings up all sorts of questions about the relationship of the contemporary to the historical archive, which are actually important. And this was Sandrine also, when you were talking about allowing the gaze of the subject or the agency of the subject to speak forth. That reminded me that, Brendan, when you asked me the question about thinking about, not just taking the artist's gaze, but also allowing for a reciprocity or for a confrontation or some other kind of gaze, other kind of agency to emerge from an image, one of the things that's really crucial about taking this historical archive seriously and not just, and I don't know where the curators are for this particular show, if they're here, is Vivian here? Yeah, but not just subsuming everything under a kind of monolithic colonial doxa. These are all the images that actually represent the colonial gaze, the white gaze, the European gaze, and actually flattening everything into some kind of monolithic narrative. What you do when you do that is you actually miss out on those moments of tension and rupture and refusal and agency that, despite the horrors of the colonial narrative, which we accept and understand and need to take into account, still have a way of escaping and still have a way of asserting the agency of those subjects. Otherwise, you re-objectify them. And I think the danger of the kind of disclaimer, if you'll forgive me, and the danger of having to think about it in that way is you re-objectify. So you have to allow for the specificity and for the possibility of refusal, resistance. Now, with this project in relation to Joe, and what interested me so much about it, and Joe, I hope you'll come in and fill us in on the detail, is that these are a group of people, Joe can tell us the particulars of the history of them, who choose to represent themselves in the guise of so-called traditional occupants of the land because it's a political strategy. They are making a bid for occupation and ownership of a land in the name of an invented historical trajectory and claim to indigeneity and ownership, which they don't have, but they perform. And they perform it through the language of historical colonial photography. So here's one of these complex negotiations where the archive provides a language for advocacy of a group of people who then turn to Joe and insist, if I remember correctly, Joe, as you explained it to me, that she photographed them in this way and in these outfits. So somebody coming into the show may say, oh, there's a white photographer re-objectifying people of color in a particular moment, creating a primitive narrative. No, that's not what's going on. And in order to be true to the specificity of the historical record and the contemporary dialogue and encounter with that record, you have to be able to unpack the specificity of those stories. Because the enemy of history is aestheticization. And aestheticization comes in many, many forms. Sometimes for the best reasons and for the most, because all sorts of ethical and political decisions. But in order to understand images historically, you have to understand them in their particularity. And that is our responsibility. And it's hard. It's hard work, and we go wrong all the time. But I think, Joe, what I love about this project is the way in which you allow us to think that complexity in its relationship both to the agency of these people and to the photographic mediations through which their self-performance can be understood. So I don't know whether you want to say more about it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tamar. That was... Joe, I think I think we're soon running out of time, and I want to move to questions, but maybe quickly, just to follow Tamar's brilliant comments just now, could you just give us a little bit of context for this diptych? And because it's not, for people who don't know, that it's not part of the work that is on view
Was in
this exhibition, but it is part of the work that is in the Walther Collection.
So it was part of a project that I worked on after the Angola project, and I was interested in the manifestations of the war back home. So looking at sites that weren't the usual sites associated with military apparatus. These were a group of sand trackers, Angolan and Namibian, who had been recruited by the South African army during the war in Angola, what was known in South Africa as the border war. And after the war, because they couldn't be repatriated because they were effectively now enemies in their home state in Angola and in Namibia, they were offered South African citizenship and were moved to South Africa, and with the promise that they would have homes. And they were settled in this place, Smitsdrift, which is very rural. It's on sort of game farms. It's near the Vaal River. It's just south of Kimberley. And they lived in tents for about 10 years. But at the point that they were going to be given houses, there were land claims on the land. And they were then not considered South African and not awarded that land. And in a very complicated story, some were moved to a nearby township south of Kimberley, Platfontein, were given land there. But there was another band who refused to move. And I wanted to photograph the site. I wasn't looking to photograph the people. And I had this very long discussion with the leader of the group, Otomove Kagenge, who wanted me to take on the advocacy of the group, which I refused. And we went in this roundabout discussion about what they needed, what they wanted. And eventually the agreement was that I could photograph the site if I would take his portrait and write down his statement. That's another photograph, which I did, and a very awkward photograph it was. And when I went back 3 months later to show him the picture, he was very happy. And then this man, Petrus Kalesh, I mean, my cameras were still in the car. There was always a long discussion, went and changed in traditional dress and went and stood next to that hut with his bow and arrow and posed and waited for me, and insisted I take his portrait. So I got my cameras out the car, I took the portrait, and I thought, I cannot do this picture. There is nothing in this picture to speak even of this century. You know, if that picture went out, it could look like it was taken in a different century. So I asked if I could take another picture of him, and that's the picture on the left, with the military hangar behind him. And I thought, well, at least maybe I would have a contemporary context. And I can't remember if I put him on that concrete block pedestal or whether he naturally stepped onto that pedestal. But when I looked at those two photographs, and those are the two choices I had, I thought, now I've turned him into a statue. I've put him above that landscape. I've put him on a plinth, and and David Goldblatt looking at them. And this is the story I have to tell, because this is what turned everything around. David hated the first picture. And I said, well, that's he said, oh, it's so patronizing. You photographed him as if you were a tourist driving through a village. He looks like something out of the diorama in the National Museum, which I agreed. And so there was no disagreement there. But when I said, well, this was how he presented himself, and David said, well, of course he's going to present himself like that because that's all he knows. And I said, well, who's being patronizing? This is a man who wasn't in a little village where tourists came past with cameras. This was a man who was a soldier from the age that he was 14 and is now a man he must have been my age, 50s or 60s. You know, I mean, you're being patronizing. This is, he's not posing for tourists. He has no history of posing for tourists. And this is a group who are advocating for their claim to this land, which was precisely because they could return to their traditional way of life. So their advocacy, they need an image that supports their advocacy. So in some senses, I'm not the representative of them. They are representing. I'm the vehicle. And of course, and that made me realize that actually it's not simple that the person behind the camera has power, is the agent necessarily. And so when I do exhibit them, I exhibit them and they are in the book facing each other. And there is a text in the book. At the back of the book, there's an interview a conversation with Patricia Hayes and I. And Otomove's statement is there. So the pictures always go out contextualized. And yeah. So that's the story that made me then think differently about photographing people and how.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I just have to say, it is such a privilege to be among such brilliance, and to hear your rigor and your deep reads and critical thinking, Tamar. Thank you so much. That this is one aspect of the collection where we are constantly learning and being challenged, and it's a privilege. So do we have time for a few questions? I don't know who is in charge here. Okay, so I think maybe people in the audience have some questions. If someone wants to ask about Crate 17, you are encouraged to do so. And if someone has a question about a primary text, of which perhaps this event may be one. So, yeah.
No, just while somebody's warming up to ask a question, I wanted to mention the brilliant work of Susan Vogel when she did Africa Explore the 20th Century in '91. And the first page has an image by Seydou Keita, and the comment is unknown photographer. I love that, to see the evidence of stupidity. That's a good thing about publishing.
Wow.
Yeah, okay. But she wrote unknown photographer.
The topic for the third panel, perhaps. But yes, do we have some questions for the group? Remy?
I just want to ask about Crate 17.
I think we're running out of time.
I mean, just a quick thing about Crate. I had never heard of Crate 17 until I came here yesterday. I think it was Vivian who said something. I said, what is Crate 17? So it's so interesting the way that then becomes a thing, an archive. I mean, you obviously constructed it as such, and how these things enter into history. So, I mean, as you were saying, that this is a primary text in itself, the accretion of meanings that come to each different iteration of the showing of the stuff, and you know, it shouldn't ossify into a thing, because hopefully it will grow bigger than one crate, and hopefully, you know, many different parts of that come to be shown and juxtaposed and published in different contexts. So it was a thing for your exhibition, but it's not a thing cast in stone.
But the very thing is also, when talking about archiving and history, etc., when we published the Anthology of African Photography, I was a bit bored that we didn't discover anyone that we didn't know. So I invented a photographer, wrote his biography, and there are a bunch of students who are calling after that to know more about this photographer who was born in the 20s, who invented the curve photography, but then his studio burned and there was only 3 items left scattered in the world. So that's how fiction can become serious.
No, and thanks for bringing that up. I meant to mention that Simon's work with Revue Noir for so long, and I'm sure you would agree, Sandrine, that the book that Simon just mentioned about the anthology of African and Indian ocean photography was like the white pages for a long time. It was like the only one, really, and that was, for anyone who studied African photography, it was like that was literally a primary text, because that's where you go to find out who these people were. So, and it continued to be very important.
But one of them is a fiction.
Okay, okay. I won't forget it. Are there other questions? Yeah.
Still thinking about the question, I would like to follow up on 2 things that Tamar said. A key word, I think, is ambivalence. You mentioned that. And I think when it comes to the colonial archives, we better be comfortable with ambivalence, because it's here to stay. And it's also the title, of course, of this brilliant volume that Patricia Hayes published last year, I believe. And we have to, I think, embrace the ambivalence. The second thing is, when I curated The Way She Looks, we were installing the exhibition, and when it was done, and we were just the 3 of us, Paul Roth, the director of the Ryerson Image Center, Gaël Morel, and myself, there was a moment where everybody was so moved, because we stepped into a room where all Black women were looking at us, you know, and it was something that actually you rarely, rarely happens, and it was all the more moving in the historical part, because we really felt like these women were not given the right to look at us before, because we did not allow ourselves to see that, because it was, colonial photography. They should be, of course, being oppressed in these images. And there was a real palpable emotion the first time we stepped into that room, and we felt like these women were allowed to be seen finally.
You know, I just have one quick question for you, Sandrine, and then we'll go to you tomorrow. The installation view that we're looking at now includes Ito Barada, a picture from North Africa of someone refusing a gaze, actually. But also, because we have Samuel Fosso in the room, I was so intrigued that in an exhibition, the way she looks, and not only women behind the camera, but as subjects. And here we have Samuel Fosso in the guise of Angela Davis, who has such a precarious relationship to the image, because when Angela Davis was underground, the only image of her that was universally known was the wanted poster for the FBI, and she became an image. She became a fiction, actually, and she has had this long trajectory of going from an outlaw to a real American icon. And I've always been fascinated. I mean, the subject of my master's thesis was in part this unraveling the onion skin of this very image and all of the images behind it, and the history of Angela Davis, and the history of Black is Beautiful, and the history of the civil rights movement that you brought to bear. So I just wanted to ask, because you were here, Samuel and Sandrine, like, what was that decision about to include Samuel's work in this project?
Well, it was, female and female identifying persons in the show. And so the idea of Samuel Fosso impersonating Angela Davis with this history that you just laid out of, complex relation to the image, it was just too layered not to be there. It wasn't a choice that I really did not think long about. It was just obvious to me. Yeah.
But wouldn't one say that it's taking away the female power by putting a male impersonating a female in this kind of very feminist...
Food for thought. Food for thought, Simon.
No, I mean, I just wanted to say, riffing off that, because even in some of those photographs that are in the vitrine over there, for example, there is the postcard of the Zulu mothers based on the cabinet print of the Zulu mothers, which we talked about quite a lot yesterday, which Chris Geary wrote a wonderful essay in the catalogue, where you find agency where you least expect to see it. So on the one hand, here you have the figuration of African femininity according to the cliche, the figuration of the woman with the baby on her back, and you would think that this is just a racist trope used for commercial purposes. But what Chris Geary did so beautifully in her essay was to show that the labor of those women posing for that photograph was something that you had to take seriously. And part of the labor was the care for the child, so bringing us back to the issue of care. She traced the photographs of those children and the situation in which those women who are working as models and as mothers in the studio at that time in a contractual arrangement. We don't know how they're being paid or if they're being paid, but we can think of it as a process of labor, including the labor of the care for those children. And she actually manages, I think, in quite a brilliant counterintuitive way, to unpack a story of female agency in the space where you would least expect to find it. And it's those kinds of, fictions, maybe. It may be a story, but it's a story for our time, as history always is. You retell the past in relation to the questions that you're asking, trying to think with and negotiating the past in dialogue so that you can be both true to that moment, but also true to the questions you want to ask. And she does something very extraordinary, as does Elizabeth Edwards, who writes about a colonial curiosity. And she, instead of the prurience of the objectifying gaze, she takes up the positive connotations of what it is to be curious. What is curiosity of the self and curiosity of the other? Is it always an objectification? And I think that this is it's difficult work, and as you said, Renee, in your beautiful introduction, it's work that takes a certain kind of courage, because you open yourself up in our identitarian times to being misunderstood or to being seen to be, on the wrong side. But as historians and as people who take visual culture seriously, we have an ethical responsibility to do it, I think. Yeah, do you want to come in on that? Sorry.
Yeah, but still, I think that archives should be looked at without guilt.
Without guilt.
Because if we look at them with guilt, it means that we're guilty somewhere. Archives are just archives, and it's up to us to give them something to say. I remember this star in the postcards of the collection. There's a lady, you look at her, you would see she's exploited, blah, 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 blah. You look at the backstory, she was a star at a time. She was the star in this postcard. She was the exemplification of something. So there was a negotiation there. And I think that in this Hegelian paradox of master and slave, we should always be careful not to always take the position of the master, because then we come up patronizing. We put things in things that are maybe easier and more simple than what we want them to be, especially in these times of decolonization, post-colonization, ba-ba-ba. I think we have to look at the things.
Santi did that brilliantly in the German pavilion in Ancestors. I don't know if some of you remember that extraordinary compilation of images, which is a complement to Black Photo Album, where, sorry.
No.
No, where, I mean, he did something quite brave and mischievous, which is to take some of those, like the Black Cleopatra, so-called, those images of reclining female figures, which, you know, for my formation as a feminist scholar, you're very, very uncomfortable about. But he insisted that this was part of the archive, that you do not sanitize the archive, that if you're thinking of your ancestors come in many guises, in all kinds of tropes and figurations. And, you know, there it was in the German pavilion. And I remember being very troubled, but at the same time, you know, challenged by it in a way that's interesting.
Santi was a very brilliant
Troublemaker. Anyway, sorry. Absolutely.
Theo, did you have a question?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to just tell a little anecdote. It's because it seems to touch on a lot of things that have just been said. When I was doing Trip to Mount Zugwala, the video of this ritual that takes place in Ethiopia, I was very aware that I was there as an artist, witnessing what would traditionally be an ethnographic event to record. And but without thinking very much, people asked me, well, how did you get so intimate in one day to witnessing an animist ritual and this Christian rituals? I said, well, because I was kneeling down while I was filming. So it came spontaneous. So it was this act of kneeling down while filming, which created both a privileged gaze to the event. Then what happened is the first girl that, at a certain point, a girl goes into a trance and just rolls all over the floor. Now, my first instinct was, well, what a photographer does in that situation is he gets up and moves closer to get a better image of what's going on, of the event, because that is an event. And I didn't. I stayed kneeling down where I was and observed it from a distance. And when the people saw that I didn't get up and move towards her, they picked her up and moved her towards me. Wow. And so she was like literally next to me because they had picked her up in a trance state, and she just continued her trance next to me and then woke up in a drunken stupor from her trance, literally at this distance. And so that's just an interesting reflection to connect with you, Joe. And this thing of also the female body, it just seems to be an anecdote which covers a lot of points that have been made. I just
No, thank you for that really vivid story. We should wrap up now, or okay? So there's one more panel this afternoon. I just want to thank you all so much. First of all, for your primary texts over the years, primary texts in the past, and more to come from brilliant scholars. Some so well established and respected, and some at the beginning of really dynamic, exciting careers. Exactly. So thank you all. It's really been a pleasure and an honor. So.